In a quiet genetics lab outside Beirut, a researcher stared at a screen for almost 10 minutes without saying a word. His colleague thought something had gone wrong with the sequencer. Nothing had gone wrong. What he was looking at was a DNA match so precise, so statistically overwhelming, that it shouldn't have been possible after 3,000 years. He wasn't comparing two living people. He was comparing a living man from modern Lebanon to the bones of someone who had been dead since before the fall of Troy. And the match wasn't close. It was almost exact. So here's the question this video is going to answer. If scientists lined up Arab DNA next to every major empire in history, Rome, Persia, Egypt, Babylon, the Ottomans, which one would actually match? Most people guess wrong. And the real answer changes how we need to think about who actually survives history. If you've ever taken one of those DNA ancestry tests, you know the feeling. You open the app, you scroll past the pie chart, and you land on a category that just says West Asian or North African or Middle Eastern, and you think, that's it? That's my entire story boiled down to one vague region on a map? For over 400 million Arabic-speaking people across 22 countries, that question isn't abstract, it's personal. Because for centuries, the story of Arab identity has been told mostly through language, religion, and empire, not biology. Through the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ottomans. But underneath all of that political history, there's a second story running in parallel, written not in ink, but in blood. And until very recently, almost nobody had actually read it. That changed when a team of geneticists decided to ask a deceptively simple question. Forget what the history books say. Conquered this region. Whose DNA actually stuck around? Let's start with the obvious guess. Rome ruled almost the entire Arab world at some point. Roman roads still exist in Jordan. Roman columns still stand in Lebanon's Baalbek. Some of the largest stone blocks ever moved by human hands. If any empire should have left its genetic fingerprint, it's Rome. So scientists pulled ancient Roman-era skeletal remains from sites across the former province of Syria-Palestina and ran the comparison. The results surprised almost everyone on the team. Roman genetic influence in the region was thin. A trace, not a foundation. Rome had built roads, aqueducts, and forts. But biologically, they were administrators passing through, not a population that replaced who was already there. One empire down, and already the assumption most people walk in with is falling apart. Next, Persia. The Achaemenid Empire once stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, swallowing Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt whole. For over 2 centuries, Persian governors, called satraps, ruled Arab lands directly. Surely that leaves a mark. It does. But mostly to the east, in Iraq and parts of the Gulf, where Persian genetic influence shows up more clearly, especially in populations with historical trade and migration links to the Iranian plateau. But when researchers moved west, into the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula's interior, and North Africa, that Persian signal faded almost to nothing. So Rome, mostly absent. Persia, regional, not universal. That means 2 of history's biggest empires, empires that literally governed these lands for centuries, did not genetically define the people living there, which raises an uncomfortable question. If conquest doesn't determine DNA, what does? Here's where it gets uncomfortable for a lot of assumptions we've been taught. Egypt's pharaohs, the Ottoman sultans who ruled for 400 years, the Mongol raids that reached into Syria, one by one, researchers tested each population's genetic footprint against modern Arab populations across the region. One by one, the same pattern kept repeating. Political rule left monuments. It left language in some cases. It left religion. But it barely touched the underlying gene pool of everyday people who had been living on that land for millennia before any of these empires arrived. Which means empires are, genetically speaking, mostly a layer of paint. The wall underneath belongs to someone else entirely. So who built that wall? To answer that, the researchers had to go back further than any recognized empire most people have heard of. Back to a civilization that gets a footnote in most history classes. but turns out to be the actual foundation. Before Rome, before Persia, before the word Arab was even used the way we use it today, the coastal strip of the eastern Mediterranean was home to a civilization called the Canaanites, and their most famous descendants, the Phoenicians. They didn't build an empire the way Rome did. They built something arguably more powerful, a trade network. Purple dye so valuable, it was reserved for kings. An alphabet so efficient, it became the ancestor of the one you're reading right now. Colonies stretching from modern Lebanon all the way to Carthage in North Africa. Then, according to the traditional history most of us were taught, the Phoenicians simply disappeared, absorbed into whichever empire came next. End of story. Except that's not what the DNA says. And this is the moment the lab result from the beginning of this video starts to make sense. In 2016, a team led by geneticist Mark Haber, working with researchers including Chris Tyler Smith and Pierre Zalua, did something that had never been done at this scale. They extracted and sequenced genetic material from a nearly 4,000-year-old skeleton found at a Canaanite era burial site in Sidon, Lebanon, a city that was a major Phoenician Canaanite trade hub in the Bronze Age. Then they compared that ancient genome to the DNA of modern Lebanese people. The result? Roughly 93% of the ancestry found in that 4,000-year-old skeleton is still present in modern Lebanese populations today, not diluted into meaninglessness, not a faint trace. The overwhelming majority of the genetic code survived, largely intact, through the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arab conquests, the Crusades, the Ottomans, and colonization. An unbroken thread running underneath every single empire that ever claimed to rule that land. That's the moment in the lab from the beginning of this video. That's what made the researcher go silent. Think about what that actually means. Every textbook version of Middle Eastern history is written like a relay race. One empire hands the baton to the next. Canaanites to Assyrians, Assyrians to Babylonians, Babylonians to Persians, Persians to Greeks, and on, as if each population got wiped out or replaced by the one that conquered it. The DNA tells a completely different story. It's not a relay race. It's one long continuous population that absorbed newcomers, soldiers, traders, small waves of migration, without being erased by them. The empires changed, the language changed, the religion changed more than once. But the people underneath all of it stayed remarkably the same. Which means the phrase Arab DNA isn't really about the Arab conquests of the 7th century at all. It's about something far older. A Levantine and Near Eastern genetic backbone that predates Islam, predates Christianity, predates even the Israelites, by well over 1,000 years. So if the Phoenicians and Canaanites are the closest genetic match in the Levant, what about the deserts further south? What about the Arabian Peninsula itself, where the word Arab actually originates? Here's the part almost nobody expects. The Arabian Peninsula, the ancestral homeland most associated with the word Arab, tells a slightly different but equally striking version of the same story. Genetic studies of populations across the Arabian Peninsula show deep, ancient roots stretching back tens of thousands of years, with some of the clearest continuity found in Y-chromosome lineages like haplogroup J1, which shows extremely high frequency across the Arabian Peninsula and correlates strongly with populations that trace unbroken paternal ancestry to some of the earliest known inhabitants of the region, long before the word empire meant anything at all. In other words, while the Levant was proving that the Canaanites never really left, the Arabian Peninsula was proving something almost identical, that its own population never left either. Two different regions, two different ancient identities, the same underlying answer. So if neither region was defined by whoever conquered it, what actually held these populations together for so long, while empires rose and collapsed around them? Let's bring this back to something personal. Imagine you're a nurse in Beirut, or a shop owner in Amman, or a student in Jeddah. and you take one of those consumer DNA tests. The report tells you Middle Eastern, 62%, and leaves it there. It's not lying to you, but it's flattening 4,000 years of continuous history into a single word on a screen. What the actual research says is far more specific, and honestly, far more powerful. Your ancestors likely include people who pressed olive oil the same way 3,000 years ago, who spoke a Semitic language that gave the world its first true alphabet, who traded purple dye across the entire Mediterranean before Rome existed as more than a village of huts. That's not a vague regional category. That's a direct, biological thread connecting you to specific, real people who left specific, real fingerprints on human civilization. But that raises a harder question, one the scientists themselves had to sit with once the data came in. Now, here's where a responsible version of this story has to slow down. Arab DNA isn't one single uniform thing, and no serious geneticist claims it is. The Arab world spans North Africa, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Arabian Peninsula, regions with different ancient populations, different migration histories, and different genetic signatures layered on top of that ancient core. A Moroccan and an Iraqi are both culturally and linguistically part of the Arab world, but genetically, they carry different ancient ancestries layered together in different proportions. Indigenous North African lineages in the Maghreb, ancient Mesopotamian lineages in Iraq, and that deep Canaanite Levantine signature concentrated most strongly in Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Jordan. So when we say only one matched, we don't mean every Arab person on Earth is genetically Phoenician. We mean something more specific and, honestly, more interesting. In every region tested, the deepest, most enduring genetic match wasn't a conquering empire. It was the population that was already there before the empire ever arrived. And once you see that pattern once, you start seeing it everywhere in history. Which is exactly why this story doesn't end here. Let's go back to that lab in Beirut one more time. The researcher who went silent for 10 minutes later described the feeling as something close to grief mixed with pride. Grief, because for most of his life, he'd been taught that his ancestors' stories started with the Arab conquests of the 7th century, a relatively recent chapter. Pride, because the DNA told him his story actually started thousands of years earlier, with people who had no armies, no emperors, no golden thrones, just ships, an alphabet, and the will to survive every single empire that tried to erase them. Rome fell. Persia fell. The Ottomans fell. Every empire that ever marched through that land eventually collapsed, and their language and their rulers faded into history books. But the people stayed, quietly, genetically, almost stubbornly. That's the real answer to the question in the title. It was never Rome. It was never Persia. It was never even a formally recognized empire in the way we usually use that word. It was an ancient, unbroken population, the Canaanites and their descendants in the Levant, and equally ancient peninsular lineages in Arabia, that outlasted every empire that ever tried to claim their land. Once this research came out, it didn't just raise questions about Arab identity. It made scientists ask the same question about every other region that's ever been conquered. If the Levant's ancient population survived the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and Ottomans virtually intact, what does that mean for Egypt, whose pharaonic population supposedly disappeared under Arab, Ottoman, and colonial rule? What does it mean for Anatolia, home to the Ottomans, where deep Anatolian farmer ancestry from 9,000 years ago is still detectable in modern Turkish populations? What does it mean for Italy, where researchers have found that some rural populations carry genetic signatures tracing back to the Etruscans, a civilization Rome was supposed to have absorbed completely? The pattern keeps repeating across the world. Conquest is loud, and biology is quiet. And quiet usually wins. So here's the real question this leaves us with, going into the next part of this story. Here's the detail that quietly changes everything one more time. Remember, the Phoenicians themselves weren't a closed, isolated population. They were sailors and traders who mixed with the very civilizations they traded with. Evidence of ancestry linked to the Western Mediterranean and even Southern Europe has shown up in later Phoenician-era remains from sites like Sardinia and North Africa, alongside their core Levantine ancestry, which means the unbroken population that outlasted every empire wasn't unbroken because it stayed pure. It survived because it was flexible enough to absorb outsiders on its own terms, without ever losing its core identity. That might be the real lesson hiding inside this entire story. Survival across 4,000 years of empires wasn't about isolation. It was about a population confident enough in who they were to let others in, without ever forgetting where they came from. So the next time someone tells you an empire conquered a people, remember what the lab in Beirut found. Empires conquer land. They rarely conquer blood. But this leaves one loose thread we haven't pulled yet. If the Levant's population secretly outlasted every empire in its own backyard, what happens when you run the exact same test on Egypt? A civilization that built the pyramids, ruled for 3,000 years, and was then conquered by Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and Ottomans, one after another. Did the pharaoh's bloodline actually disappear the way most people assume? Or is there another lab, somewhere else in the world right now, about to have the exact same silent 10-minute moment all over again? That's next.